reading The Great Turkey Walk by Kathleen Karr, reading chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10. Things kind of went smooth then for a while, past Independence, which we steered clear of, and into the Kansas Territory. Funny thing about Jabeth, as we got nearer and nearer to that territory, he got jumpier than a bullfrog in high croaking season. "Mr. Peace, sir," he kept hounding the man at every opportunity. "Are we there yet?" "Well," Mr. Peace would answer, "first off, we got to get past Westport. Then, after Westport, will there be some line, some sort of mark across the road to point out the end of Missouri and slave land and the start of freedom?" "Ain't exactly like that, Jabeth," Mr. Peace went on. "Prairie just kind of continues. One step pretty much the same as the last till we get into the Indian country." "Indian country?" That got my attention right enough. Never have seen no Indians in my entire life. "That's on account of how the enlightened state of Missouri kicked them all out some years back, Simon. Sent them farther west. Government told them there'd be new lands there for them to hold forever." "And?" I asked. Mr. Peace sighed. "Well, now, forever in the mind of Indians and forever in the mind of white folks seems to be two entire separate things." "Enough about Indians," Jabeth butted in. "When we going to be in freedom country?" We hit the tiny village of Shawnee and moved on through. Once more on the open prairie at the other side, Mr. Peace slowed the mules and glanced down at Jabeth. "That's it," he said. "What's it, Mr. Peace, sir?" "Why, Shawnee. It's as close as I can come to an exact marking line. Shawnee's in Kansas story for sure." "You mean—" Jabeth stood stock still in the middle of the dusty road a long moment. Then he hitched up in his newly broken-in boots and went for a mighty leap. "I'm in freedom country! I'm free! A free man!" It felt kind of curious watching Jabeth's enthusiasm over something I'd never thought much about before meeting my new friend. What if it was me in his boots? Well, I suppose I'd be mighty relieved too. I guess Mr. Peace figured the same, because pretty soon Jabeth had dragged him from his perch on the wagon seat, and the three of us was dancing around and backslapping to high heaven. It took us a while to settle down. Then we had to calm Emmett, who'd gone into a rare barking fit due to our antics. Next, we had to regather the flock, which had taken flight and fright also over our unexpected enthusiasm. It was worth it, just the same. Jabeth, he had a silly grin plastered over his face straight into the evening. Added a couple inches to his height, too. He was walking that tall. And that's the way we traveled for the next few days, straight along the narrow, gritty trail that passed for a highway into Indian country. I was really waiting on my first sight of Indians. Didn't care how ferocious they looked. The wilder, the better. Far as I was concerned, I'd already met enough so-called civilized folks. This particular piece of land we was headed for belonged to the Potawatomi, Mr. Peace said, although there was some Shawnee and Kaw and Fox toward the south. The Potawatomi were supposed to be a peaceful sort of people who hunted a little and farmed a little and did whatever else was necessary to keep body and soul together. "What do they hunt for, Mr. Peace?" I asked one evening as we was settling into camp. "Why, buffalo, Simon." I stared long and hard over the wild, endless prairie spreading around us. Ain't seen anything like a buffalo. Nothing like the pictures in Miss Rogers' book. "You sure they're still about, Mr. Peace? Sure they ain't all been done in by settlers and such?" Mr. Peace swiped at some dust on his cheek. "Well, I'll tell you. In the old days, they was thick as flies in these parts. Going south from Independence on the Santa Fe Trail, why, we counted on 'em to keep us in meat. The Indians did too. They could take a buffalo and strip it down till there was nothing left but the fleas. Made their houses and clothing and blankets from the skins. Ate the meat, used the bones for tools. Wasn't enough leavings when you was done to tempt even a hungry vulture." I considered that information. Sounds like a useful sort of animal. It was. I hope it still is. Jabeth had been listening the entire time. Meanwhile, he was polishing up his bowie knife. He looked up now with a gleam in his eyes. "Think I could get me one with this knife?" Mr. Peace cut a grin. "You see a buffalo with only that in your hand, Jabeth? You turn and run the other way. Fast." "Why? How big could one be?" "Big. Furry and horned and mean once their dander's up. Only thing that'll take one down is a rifle." Jabeth glanced toward the wagon, where my pa's rifle was still stashed, along with Cleaver's revolver and their packs, all untouched since the day we'd acquired them. "Maybe it'd be time to start learning about guns." "Buffalo steak." Mr. Peace licked his lips. "Liver for my strength. Marrow soup. I could maybe get past my own gun feelings for that. Always used to tote one in the old days anyhow." "Why'd you stop, Mr. Peace?" I asked. He gazed on me sorrowfully. Too much strong drink and guns don't go together, son. A man loses his perspective, starts to let off a little steam. Pretty soon, somebody gets hurt. He stopped. Gave up guns when I took to serious drinking. Least I had enough sense for that. Jabeth was listening to all this with an expression on his face as if gears and wheels were turning and clicking. So you do know how to make them work? Guns? Well, I should think so. And you've been stone cold sober the entire time we've been acquainted? Mr. Peace rubbed at his chin. I guess that's true. Jabeth carefully resheathed his knife. That being the case, any reason why you couldn't give me some shooting lessons, Mr. Peace, sir? Lots. None of which I intends to go into now. And that's all we could get out of Mr. Peace on the subject of guns that entire night. The first shooting lesson commenced just past dawn the next morning. That was after Jabeth and I woke up and continued our badgering campaign. Mr. Peace was every bit as reluctant to do it, using his fear of scaring the turkeys as an excuse once he couldn't get past the fact that he was undoubtedly more sober than he'd been in 15 years. 15 years? That figure he'd let out caught my interest. You mean it was exactly 15 years ago you lost your loved ones? Mr. Peace nodded sadly. Ain't it strange? That was happening right about the time I was being born? Don't see what that's got to do with anything, Simon. Can't be positive, but it seems like more than coincidence to me, Mr. Peace. The Lord took away, but he was given back at the same time. Only it was 15 years till all of us got together. Almost like a real family. You and me and Jabeth here. I swung toward my friend. Ain't you about 15 too? Born in 45, my mama always said. So there. I turned back to Mr. Peace triumphantly. So what? He complained. Fond as I am of you two boys, I can't say I see much logic behind your way of thinking. I didn't bother asking what logic meant, just proceeded right along. I dreamed of buffalo the night before, huge, horned, and hairy, and the whole business was now arousing my interest in rifles as much as Jabeth's. So you got at least part of a family back, Mr. Peace, and you ain't even looked crosswise at a saloon last few towns we passed through. Seems to me your perspective's right back where it belongs. I stopped for a breath and summed up. Which means there's no reason in this world you can't give Jabeth and me a few shooting lessons. Mr. Peace slung his hat onto the ground and growled, I give up. Fetch the weapons. We left Emmett guarding the walking flock and tramped through a section of waist-high prairie grass till we figured we was far enough from camp so that the birds wouldn't be skittered. The trees had been thinning out remarkably the last few days of the journey, and the only thing stretching around us was miles of flattish prairie and one lone cottonwood next to a creek. Here, Mr. Peace said, as there ain't no other targets at hand, we'll have to settle on that there tree. Jabeth already had his hand stretched out for the rifle. Mr. Peace swatted it away. First, you got to learn about the basics. Loading and proper handling. Why? Jabeth was annoyed. He was itching to start shooting that poor little tree away, leaf by leaf. Because guns ain't no joke, and I don't intend to be blown from this life premature, not after it just started getting interesting again. Mr. Peace proceeded to waste an entire hour of travel time with those basics. Jabeth and I, we listened, but after a while it got harder and harder to pay attention. Mr. Peace must have seen it because he finally handed the weapon to Jabeth. Here you go, son. Do your worst. Jabeth fondled the loaded weapon for a minute like it was holy. Then he raised it toward the tree. See what little branch hanging out over the crick in the right? What about it? I asked. Jabeth aimed and pulled the trigger. Just like that, the explosion near deafened me. After I finished blinking, that little branch wasn't there anymore. That's what. He handed the weapon to me, grinning. Your turn, Simon. I looked to Mr. Peace. He'd gone sort of pale all over. He swallowed. Go ahead, Simon. Load her. Like Jabeth said, it's your turn. I went through the entire procedure Mr. Peace had been explaining. Then I pointed to another branch and took my shot. The rifle barreled into my shoulder, something fierce. I dropped the butt and rubbed at where it pained while opening my eyes hopefully. End result was that Cottonwood had no need to be scared of me. Anybody see where the shot went? Mr. Peace pointed about 45 degrees across the prairie from the tree. Somewhere's over there. Oh. He slapped me on the back. Don't feel bad, Simon. We're not all born to be sharpshooters. After that, we let off another few rounds, then turned to head back to camp. Except we turned into unexpected company. There was a row of boys and men standing behind us, a half dozen of them. Must have crept up mighty quietly out of complete nowhere. They was dressed in longish hair, leather pants, and ragged shirts, almost worse than Jabeth's old duds. Their faces were dark, too, but not like Jabez, closer to the fine bronze of my turkeys than chocolate. I opened my mouth and shut it. I tried again. Indians? Looks like it, Simon, Mr. P said, real calm and collected. He lowered the rifle now in his own left hand and raised his right. How? Good morning, one of them answered. Fine morning for shooting? Sure is, Mr. Peace's Adam's apple wobbled. Aside from the fact that you are currently on Indian reservation lands where it is strictly illegal for any but tribal members to discharge weapons. Mr. Peace's right hand dropped. Well, now I guess the boys and I ain't been careful enough about our geography. Why don't you gentlemen head back to camp with us for a little breakfast and we can discuss our apologies over some beans and pan bread. The Indian in charge nodded, and we filed back through the grass. It was lucky Mr. Peace had set the big cauldron to simmer with beans before we'd gone off for our lessons. Now he gave it a mighty stir and pulled out the fry pan to start in on the hot bread. I broke into the corn and scattered some for the birds so they wouldn't start marching down the trail in advance of us. All this time our new acquaintances sort of poked around camp. Their leader was a man maybe about my pa's age, not quite as big, but looking to be hiding almost as much strength in the muscles beneath his faded blue shirt. Well, he started off admiring the horses. Then he and the others moved on to Sparky and his brothers. The younger Indians seemed real interested in the mules. Snowball even permitted a slim fella to rub his ears before trying for a nip at a tooth bracelet dangling from his wrist. Lastly, the Indians followed themselves to comment on the existence of my turkeys. Meantime, Emmett kept a watchful eye on the lot of them. He wasn't real upset the way he'd been with my pa and Cleaver, more sort of on the alert, standing stiff on all four spindly bowed legs. Finally, we all hunkered down to the meal. I started in apologizing for the lack of proper plates, then shut my trap. The Indians were already solving the problem in the simplest way. They just took a hold of Mr. Peace's flatbread and scooped into the bean pot we ate. Into the bean pot with it. We ate in silence till every bean and crumb of bread was gone. 3 pots of coffee, too, passing the cups around. It was real communal. The one in the faded blue shirt who'd talked to us at the start presently sank back on his haunches. I was kind of waiting for him to belch or maybe let loose with a little gas after consuming so many beans, but he didn't. Instead, he went and pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at his mouth and fingers before tucking it away again. So much for wild Indians. Thank you for your hospitality. His voice, after all the quiet, made me jump. You're probably wondering about us as much as we are about you and your unusual herd. His lips parted over white teeth. I am John Winter Prairie. The John part courtesy of my teachers at Shawnee Mission as a boy. He motioned to his companions, all of them sprawled comfortably, digesting, but real alert nonetheless. Sort of like Emmett. We are Potawatomi, much diminished from our great days in the wild rice country to the north. Regrettably. But then our grandfathers made a few bad business deals with your great white father in Washington. That, coupled with smallpox and unfortunate taste of your whiskey. He paused, and I stole a fast look at Mr. Peace. My drover was nodding in complete understanding. The Indian raised both palms. Such things do tend to change one's future. What we've got left is a small area of this Kansas prairie, very small. You can understand how we might wish to hold on to such as is remaining to us, however humble it may be, however insignificant our rules may seem to the passing world. Jabez had been making himself near invisible, keeping very quiet during the entire meal. Now he apparently couldn't hold his tongue another moment. We didn't kill a single creature on your land, Mr. Winter Prairie, sir, not even a rabbit. We was just in mind of a little target practice, for maybe catching us a buffalo up ahead. There's been rustlers after us, too. Rustlers? The Indian's dark eyes gave Jabez a piercing look. Yes, sir, turkey rustlers. After Simon here's entire worldly goods. Got the best of 'em once already back in Missouri, but they's like slave catchers in their determination. Some folks just don't ever understand that certain things is private property, like a man's soul. Jabez sat up straighter. Or these here lands of yours, which we didn't properly know was yours. But we'll be mighty pleased to vacate soon's we can hit the trail again, Mr. Peace finished. Paying you for any damage done, fair and square, though I don't rightly think there was any, I tacked on. John Winter Prairie smiled at last. It softened the fierceness of his hawk-like nose. You seem unusually honorable for men of the non-Indian persuasion. He swung to his feet in one graceful movement, as if they'd poised on springs. His friends followed suit. Why don't we call your breakfast payment in full for any incursions unintentionally made? He studied us again, and I could have sworn I saw laughter in his eyes. There's not much to do out here, after all, and we occasionally like to collect a little news of the world. Mr. Peace wiped sweat from his face. That's right, neighborly of you gents. If you feel like another meal whilst we're still traversing your lands, feel free. Unfortunately, our lands do not extend much farther than another day's journey for you. We are compressed in a very tight box, and how much longer we have, even in this box, is questionable. You mean you can't go beyond your lands? I blurted out. What if you need to hunt? For buffalo or something? Don't look for buffalo on Potawatomi lands, or anywhere else nearby. The great beast is long gone from here. The herds of millions are nearly no more. I scratched my head. How could that be? Millions of buffalo ought to last forever. Ask your white hunters who kill them for sport, leaving their carcasses to rot. The Indian visibly checked his anger. But I think you aren't that sort of people. No, sir. No way. We all shook our heads with force. I thought not. You seem reasonable. He surveyed the camp again. Being reasonable men, you wouldn't care to trade for those 2 horses, would you? Not on your life, Mr. Peace blurted out. I mean, I appreciate your interest in them, Mr. Winter Prairie, I surely do. But they's the start of my herd for farther out west, after we get these turkeys to market in Denver. John Winter Prairie nodded. You have sound judgment in horse flesh. I wish you well in your travels. Then they was gone, disappeared into the grass, the entire lot of Potawatomi, without ever a peep from the rest of them. I turned to Mr. Peace. You sure they was Indians? I never heard nobody talk like that before. Not even the preacher at church. And where was the feathers and moccasins and such? They wore boots, same as you and me. Mr. Peace shook his head. It's a frightening thing when even the Indians get civilized. A man don't know where he stands anymore. Still, Winter Prairie there was nice enough, even if he seemed to be doing a little jesting with us now and again. He poked his nose into the bean pot. Wasn't a thing strange about their appetites, though. His head bobbed up again. Maybe we ought to consider standing watch the next few nights anyhow. Those Potawatomi got themselves an inventory of our entire worldly goods. Chapter 11. Nothing came during our night watch except the beginnings of a wind that was to whistle and moan and blow at us clear across the open prairie lands for days on end. That wind seemed to start just about where the last of the humans ended, Indians and settlers both. It wasn't until the next afternoon, though, that something else came out of the surrounding shoulder-high, blue-stem grass that was seared brown and dry by the same wind. First, it was Jabeth bolting from nowhere, a few partridges hanging from his belt. Company coming, he sang out in warning. Mr. Peace stopped the wagon short. The horses tied behind on loose ropes danced to a halt. My birds started bunching into one another, their strides broken. Emmett ignored the birds and set into a barking jag. Bidwell Peace craned his neck and trained his eyes to the northeast, where even I could now see some sort of motion parting the tall grass. We're past the reservation already, ain't that so, Mr. Peace? I asked with a sudden sense of foreboding. Gotta be, he muttered. Wonder what the rules truly is about Indians leaving their lands versus white folks crossing them. Jabeth was already by the rear of the wagon. Want I should haul out the rifle, Mr. Peace, sir? Rather you didn't. I got a distaste for violence in general. Also, wouldn't do a whole pack of good if there's more of them than there is of us. Jabez didn't like that answer. What we supposed to do then? Just sit here a-waiting to be done in? Ain't a solitary place to take shelter on this blamed empty prairie. If there was some decent woods, at least. I clambered up the wagon next to Mr. Peace to get a better viewpoint. Coming closer, I reported, seems to be only a batch, in a more or less straight line through the grass. I squinted some more, then let out a whistle. Son of a gun! What is it, Simon? Mr. Peace stood on the bench next to me, and Jabez clawed up the side too. What in thunder? Monsters, Jabez squeaked. They's monsters coming at us. I started to chuckle, then it grew into a belly laugh. Jabez and Mr. Peace both pounded at me till I took control of myself again. Let go! Stop! I cried. Ain't monsters at all. Nor Indians neither. It's only camels, and they're carrying Paw and Cleaver. That does it. Jabez scrambled down and headed for the wagon's rear. Ain't nobody gonna stop me from loading the rifle this time. Paw and Cleaver must have gone back to their circus after all. Where else would they get camels? A whole family of them. For as they came closer, I couldn't help but recognize the papa camel that groaned so pitifully when loaded with burdens in the circus ring. Also the mama camel. Cleaver was riding her, just behind Paw, and behind them, loping to keep up, was the little fellow. Their gait was kind of unnatural, but maybe that's the way of it with camels. What also wasn't natural was that Pa and Cleaver was doing as they bore down on us. I don't believe it, Mr. Peace breathed out. After all the water that's water what's already flowed under the bridge, even after mentioning them to the Indians, I never really believed that Pa and Cleaver would come after us again. Right. And now those scoundrels are aiming rifles at us? Not only were they aiming, they were actually beginning to shoot. Duck, I yelled and acted accordingly. Those shots shouldn't really have troubled me, though. First off, they was aimed from the top of camels, which looked to be the closest thing to riding an earthquake I'd ever seen. And from what I understood, earthquakes wasn't conducive to straight shooting. Next, there was Jabeth, stretched out full length next to the wagon gate, ready to pick off anything that moved should he decide to pull his trigger. Why he didn't was a mystery. I snuck around the side of the wagon, the sheltered side, to find out exactly why. Why aren't you shooting back, Jabeth? I stretched out next to him on the ground. They still jerking around too much on them monsters. Wouldn't mind winging either of them a little. Indeed, I wouldn't. He kept his attention straight ahead at the oncoming enemy, but I ain't got no heart for outright murder. Oh, I cogitated on that as Pa finally broke through the grass, camel complaining to high heaven. Beyond everything else, Pa was still my Pa. I guess I know what you mean. It's all right, Jabeth. Cleaver broke through next. Finally came the little fellow. He stood there chuffing and staring at my wagon and mules and turkeys like he'd just come to the circus for the first time. My mules must have thought something similar, because they started braying their blamed heads off. So then we had what you might call a standoff. There was all the assorted livestock provoked with each other to high heaven. There was Emmett barking himself hoarse. There was Pa and Cleaver pointing guns at us, and us pointing guns at them. At least one gun. Pa spoke first. He had to raise his voice above the din to do so. Glad to see you still got your flock, Simon. He clutched at his mount a little queasily as it swayed beneath him. Made good time, too. Considerate of you to worry over it all, Pa, I shouted back. He's just that kind of fellow, piped Cleaver from behind, all the way clear from Russellville to Independence, where the circus boat was awaiting. Your Pa just couldn't stop worrying over you and your birds, Simon. Wondered how far you were getting. Wondering if you were hanging on to those birds better than we did during our short period of acquaintance with them. In between peeling off patches of tar and turkey feathers, of course. The tarring and feathering was complimentary, thoughtfully performed by those Russellville folks you dumped us with. They was an interesting group of people, I opined. Pa spit, then managed to nudge at his camel's middle. Down, Allie. He gave that order with more assurance in his voice than in his face, which seemed a mite on the green side. It was fascinating watching what all a camel has to go through to get rid of its rider. All that groaning and tucking in of legs, whilst first its front, then finally its rear hits the dirt. Not anywhere near as useful as a mule or horse that could easily be unmounted. With a final whoomp, Allie completed the process. Pa crawled off with evident relief, rifle foremost. I was curious, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to ask a question. How's that you and Cleaver didn't make off with that other matched pair of Arabian horses at the circus, Pa, instead of with these accursed dregs of the animal world? Pa swung his free hand a little too close to Allie's mouth. The camel went for it with a solid crunch of teeth. Ow! Pa kicked at the camel and pulled his hand free. Tarnation! He nursed it under his armpit. You see what I mean? You think we didn't go for those horses first? Unfortunately, drawled Cleaver from his perch, unfortunately, our old comrades had put a watch on the more valuable animals. As we really couldn't be expected to ride the lion or tiger, and as we had no interest in the trained dogs, our choice of transport was narrowed down. Cleaver made sure that Pa was in control of his weapon again before kicking his own camel into a seated position. He removed himself with more aplomb than Pa had. I've actually grown somewhat fond of Fatima here during our short, closer acquaintance. Haven't I, Fatima? At that point, the little camel butted Cleaver out of the way to gain access to his mama. If it wasn't for this youngster that set up such a wail, we had to bring him along. Cleaver brushed himself down, then reached for his rifle again. I'm afraid I find all children to be distasteful nuisances. Anyhow, Pa got himself back into the conversation at last. He steadied wobbly legs and burped, and his complexion turned healthier. Anyhow, Cleaver and me put a lot of thought into what we done wrong with them birds the last time. We figured we're now in a position to improve our methods and get them safely to Denver. Seeing as how that's the case, we thought you all might consider a trade. A trade? I asked. Folks sure had a high interest in trading these days. Yep, these here priceless camels straight from the mysterious east for your entire traveling establishment. Mr. Peace let out a hoot behind me. I guessed that was a sort of hint, but I didn't need to think about Pa's suggestion for any length of time anyhow. Sorry, Pa. Camels is fine creatures, I'm sure, especially on the far distant deserts of Egypt where they belongs. But I don't think the folks in Denver would want to pay me $5,000 for them, priceless or not. Enough of this silly talk, Simon. Jabeth finally broke in. Tell your Pa and Cleaver that if they don't set down their weapons right fast, there's going to be missing a few limbs. Cleaver chuckled. You have one gun. We have two. What happens after you use your shot? Think there will be time to reload? You didn't have time to reload your guns either, Jabeth pointed out. Reasonably, I thought. You didn't have time to reload your guns either. Ah, but we have 2 rifles each. Without turning, Cleaver motioned behind to his camel. Sure enough, another rifle was slung from her hump. Hadn't noticed it in the rush of events. These rifles in hand, Cleaver gestured. These are fully loaded. I don't lie. This is no coconut shy. I looked to Mr. Peace, who hadn't said aught the entire time, discounting his hoot. He only squatted there, holding back Emmett, trying to keep the little dog from taking on both Pa and Cleaver single-handed. I saw my drover's shoulders slump in defeat. What now, I wondered. Was we all just going to lounge around here in the hot sun and dry winds, listen to my mules bray and my turkeys gobble till kingdom come? I guess I forgot about Jabeth again, even though he was sprawled out right next to me. But he must have noticed Mr. Peace's dejection, too. Only he decided on action. I ain't giving up so easy. He raised the barrel of his rifle and let loose. In a moment, Cleaver's right hand dropped its weapon, and his left snatched for the wounded arm. Pa hesitated with his firearm a second too long. Maybe he was figuring on whether he truly wanted to shoot his only son, too. I'd like to think that was the case. Meanwhile, other things was beginning to happen, but it took a while to figure them all out. Something else swept out of the grass surrounding us. A bunch of somethings, bare-chested and done up with war paint, swinging rifles and hatchets and whooping up a storm. My mouth dropped open as I realized these were Indians. True blood and thunder Indians. I didn't know where to look anymore. At Pa and Cleaver, my fine turkeys under attack from all sides. Jabeth paid no attention, only started and reloading with his gun as fast as he could. It still takes time, though, and when he was finally ready to aim again, the whole situation was already over. I crawled up from my spot in the dirt. I blinked, feeling in a daze. Pa and Cleaver was being bound hand and foot by men who suddenly looked a lot like our Potawatomi under all that amazing war paint. I walked closer. Mr. Winter Prairie? I asked, searching through the stripes of red and yellow on his high-boned cheeks. Is that you underneath all that? He grinned. It would seem to be. But I thought you Potawatomi was peace-loving hunters and farmers. We are. He checked to make certain his friends was doing a solid job with those ropes. But occasionally we get bored. We also get curious when strangers on camels cross our reservation without a by your leave. We begin to put 2 and 2 together as the official peacekeepers for our territory. We feel it incumbent upon ourselves to see that nothing unorthodox occurs in our lands. But sure and certain, we're way past your lands by this time. That would be a matter of interpretation of boundaries, would it not? And all white men know that Indians are too uneducated to truly perceive such concepts as boundaries. But my head was truly reeling by this time. But nothing, Simon. Mr. Peace was by my side at last. He stretched out his fingers to Mr. Winter Prairie. May I have the honor of shaking your hand, sir? Never saw such perfect timing in my life. They shook. Mr. Peace gave me a nudge, and I shook too. Finally, Jabeth completed the process. All this time, the camels was staring at us like we was out of our minds. The turkeys, too. A thought came to me. Mr. Winter Prairie? He listened. Sir, I'd like to thank you for your help, you and all your friends. I pointed at some of his younger comrades, who was currently having a good roaring laugh over Pa and Cleaver, trussed up in the middle of the road. I'd like to make you a present, too. You surely deserve it. Ain't like a payment or anything. I'd remembered almost insulting Jabeth some time back. Just a free will gift from me to you and your entire tribe. Something of your liking. John Winter Prairie's eyes immediately shot to Mr. Peace's prize Arabians. Then they noted the look on the older man's face. The Indian turned his attention to my other livestock. I thank you for your kind offer, and I must admit that I've been thinking about turkeys, young man, since we last met. Historically, some of my people considered them stupid and cowardly. My mouth opened in protest, but Mr. Winter Prairie just pressed on, and they refused to eat them for fear of acquiring those characteristics. He paused to study my flock, a short-sighted attitude, I'm afraid. But your birds exhibit something grander. And it's time for us to move into the modern age as far as poultry husbandry is concerned. We still have a few wild turkeys locally, but if that stock were to be mixed with a little fresh blood... I gulped. Yes, sir. That'd be a fine idea. How many would you like? How many hens will a tom mate with in the spring? Knowing a fair amount about such things, I blurted it out before considering. 10 to 12 hens to the tom, sir. The hens will lay you 30 to 40 eggs each by late March. A few seasons of that, and you've got yourself a flock of your own. He nodded gravely, then pulled out the handkerchief I recalled and began to scrub at his face paint. Curious stuff, this. I'm not even certain we got the old patterns right. No one seems to remember exactly, but bold colors did seem to be called for. He finished the scrubbing. How about a dozen hens, then, and 2 toms, just to be safe? Throw in the camels if you don't know what to do with them. We might try breeding them as well. I breathed a sigh of relief. It could have been worse, much worse, and I'd already begun wondering what to do with the camel critters, seeing as how many mules appeared to take offense over them. You've got a deal, sir, I paused, if you'll promise to keep my paw and Cleaver too. Mr. Winter Prairie's attention shot to the captive. That giant's your father? I nodded sadly. I guess we never quite took as family. Don't hurt him, please, but I'd sooner get to Denver on my own. He studied Pa again. I can understand that. Excessive punishment shouldn't be necessary. Winter Prairie's glance passed my paw to focus on the flock. My choice? Yes, sir. They's all fine, solid birds. Well, I guess it hurt a little to see another 14 of my flock disappearing, but it was for a good cause. It was nice thinking my turkeys might be the start of something useful for these peaceful type Potawatomi. In a few years, they could be walking birds to Denver themselves. It didn't pain that much to say goodbye to my paw again, though. He shot me a look that could kill before commencing to make noises worse than the camels when they all slunk off through the tall grass. Cleaver didn't say boo. He was too busy wincing over his wounded arm that Jabeth had solicitously wrapped up for him. It was a nice clean shot, Mr. Cleaver, Jabeth said as he did the work. The ball went clear through your upper muscle and out again, just like I planned. It shouldn't be much more than a little sore for a while if you keep it tended. After they'd all disappeared, Mr. Peace went around inspecting things. Looks to be a little late in the day to set off again, Simon. Any problems with just bedding down on the spot? I shook my head no. Mr. Peace bent to pick up one discarded rifle, then another. We seem to be collecting us an entire armory, boys. Sure hope it don't portend things to come.